They sent him to explore. They sent him to gather data, but they never expected him to come back with this. A lone spacecraft drifted in the shadow of Saturn, its rings glowing like a cosmic halo. Inside, a man sat motionless, his breath fogging. The visor of his helmet, his wide, unblinking eyes, were fixed on something beyond comprehension. What was supposed to be a routine scientific mission became something else entirely. 3 weeks, alone, orbiting the most enigmatic planet in our solar system. The silence of deep space pressed against his mind. The eerie glow of Saturn's rings shifted, whispering, almost watching. At first, everything followed protocol. He checked his instruments, he transmitted reports, he marveled at the impossible beauty of the gas giant. But then, the anomalies began. Signals that weren't coming from Earth. Disturbances in his trajectory that defied physics. A shadow moving across the rings, something vast, something that was not supposed to be there. And then, the voices. Not in his head. Not hallucinations, real, measured, speaking in tones and cadences that no human mouth could form. They didn't speak in words, they spoke in meaning, and they knew his name. Mission Control dismissed it. Space does strange things to the mind, they said. But he knew better. He knew what he saw, what he felt, and then came the missing time. Hours, whole, days lost in the void. His logs were corrupted. His own voice, recordings of him speaking, contained words he did not remember saying. 3 weeks passed. He was recovered. He was debriefed. And yet, his official report contained nothing unusual. A perfect mission, they claimed. No anomalies, no contact. But he knew the truth, because every night since his return, when he closes his eyes, he is back there, orbiting Saturn, and the voices are still speaking his name. The first few nights back on Earth, he convinced himself it was just an adjustment period. The mind struggles to return to normal after weeks in space, after prolonged isolation. The human brain, they say, is not meant to comprehend the vastness of the cosmos, and sometimes it bends under the weight of it. That's what he told himself as he lay in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling that he was still weightless, still drifting, still being watched. But it wasn't just his mind playing tricks. The dreams weren't dreams at all. They were too vivid, too precise, too real. In them, he wasn't on Earth. He was still there, orbiting Saturn, staring into the endless swirl of clouds, feeling something, some presence surrounding him, speaking without words, pouring thoughts into his mind like liquid light. And the worst part? He would wake up with the distinct feeling that no time had passed, as if his body was here, but his consciousness was still trapped out there in the blackness, looping back and forth between two existences. He stopped sleeping. He avoided mirrors, because sometimes, when he caught his own reflection in the corner of his eye, his face wasn't quite right, his mouth moving when he wasn't speaking, his eyes too dark, too hollow, as if something else was staring back at him. He tried telling someone once, a former colleague who had worked in psychological evaluations for returning astronauts. He started small, mentioning sleep disturbances, the sensation of being disconnected. The man nodded, understanding, saying it was common among those who had spent extended periods in space. Then he mentioned the missing time, the strange signals, the voices. The moment he did, the air in the room changed. The friendly concern on the psychologist's face stiffened into something colder, more analytical. The session was cut short. Within hours, he received a call from the agency, a polite but firm warning that he was to cease discussing any anomalies regarding the mission. His reports had already been finalized, reviewed, and classified. There was no record of any of the disturbances he had experienced. As far as the world was concerned, he had spent 3 uneventful weeks in orbit, collected his data, and returned safely. That was the official story, and that was how it would stay. But the more he tried to push it away, the worse it became. The gaps in his memory weren't just limited to space. Here, on Earth, whole moments would slip through his fingers. He would sit at his kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee, only to blink and find the cup empty, his hands gripping it tightly as if he had been frozen for hours. The radio would crackle with static when he walked past. Streetlights flickered. When he was near, people around him, strangers, acquaintances, would pause mid-sentence when speaking to him, their eyes glazing over for just a second before snapping back into focus, as if something had pressed pause on reality itself. And then there were the whispers. Not just in his dreams anymore. Sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet, he would hear them just beyond the edge of sound, a presence just outside his field of vision. They weren't threatening, but they were waiting, watching, and then one night he saw it. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. He had been awake for hours, sitting in his darkened living room, the television on but silent, his mind too restless to focus on anything. The street outside was empty. A deep, unnatural stillness filled the air, as if the entire world had stopped breathing. And then, in the reflection of the window, he saw the silhouette standing behind him, tall, motionless. Its shape was human, but its proportions were wrong, too elongated, the limbs slightly curved, as if its body followed a different set of physical laws. And worst of all, it wasn't casting a shadow. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. The moment stretched, frozen in time, his own breath locked inside his chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. After that, he knew the truth. They had followed him back. Or maybe he had never really left them. He stopped trying to fight it. He stopped pretending that everything was normal, that he was just another man back from a long mission, reintegrating into society. Because deep down, he knew he wasn't the same. He wasn't just haunted by memories. He was still connected to whatever had been out there with him. The realization settled into his bones like a slow-moving poison. Maybe he hadn't returned alone. Maybe something had hitched a ride inside him, embedded itself into his thoughts, threading through his subconscious like an invisible parasite. He started noticing it in the way he spoke. Sometimes, mid-sentence, words would slip out in a language he didn't know, sounds that felt more like concepts than syllables. And when people heard them, they would blink in confusion. Suddenly, unable to recall what they had been saying just moments before. Other times, he would wake up in places he didn't remember going to, standing in the middle of an empty parking lot at 3 a.m, his bare feet against the cold asphalt, staring up at the sky as if waiting for something to answer back. Then the messages began. Not phone calls, not emails. They came in ways that made no logical sense, words appearing on fogged-up glass when no one had been there to write them, whispers crackling through his radio in the dead of night, strange symbols scrawled in the margins of his old mission notebooks, written in his own handwriting, but in patterns he didn't recognize. He took photos, tried to document them, but every time he looked back at the images, they were blank, as if whatever was communicating with him didn't want to be seen, only felt. And it wasn't just messages, it was instructions. At first, they were subtle, small nudges, an impulse to walk a different route home, to glance at a specific page in a book, to tune his radio to a frequency filled with nothing but empty static. Except it wasn't empty. If he listened closely, he could hear something beneath the noise, something deep, something layered, something trying to tell him what came next. And then people around him started changing. He didn't know how else to explain it. Friends, colleagues, people he had known for years began acting differently, not all the time, just in brief. Flashes, little moments where they would pause mid-conversation, their faces going slack for just a second before snapping back into focus. Their voices would stutter in ways that weren't natural. Their eyes would linger on him too long, unblinking, as if seeing something beneath his skin. And worst of all, some of them, only a few, but enough to notice, stopped responding to their own names. He tested it, called out to them, waited for their reaction. Sometimes they would hesitate before answering, as if processing the sound, as if recalibrating, as if they were no longer used to being called what they used to be. One night, he followed one of them, a co-worker, a woman he had worked with for years, someone who had always been predictable, routine-oriented. But lately, she had changed. She no longer spoke about her family, no longer talked about weekend plans, no longer seemed entirely present. He saw her leave the office late at night and decided to follow at a distance. She didn't go home. Instead, she walked, without hesitation, without looking around, straight to an abandoned building on the edge of town. She disappeared inside. He waited, heart pounding, every instinct telling him to turn back, to forget it, to pretend none of this was happening. But he had to know. So he followed. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with something he couldn't name. The room was vast, empty except for a single light flickering in the center. And then he saw them. A dozen people, maybe more, standing in a perfect circle. Silent, motionless, their heads tilted slightly upward, as if waiting for something above them to respond. The woman he had followed was among them. He wanted to call out, to demand an explanation, but something held his voice hostage in his throat. And then it happened. The air shifted. It was the only way to describe it. A low, humming sound filled the space, deep and resonant, vibrating in his chest like a force beyond sound itself. The people in the circle moved in unison, heads snapping, downward as if receiving a signal, and then, in perfect synchronization, they turned to look directly at him. He ran. He didn't remember how he got home. His next memory was waking up in his apartment, heart still racing, a metallic taste in his mouth. He tried telling himself it was a dream, a hallucination, the result of exhaustion and paranoia. But he knew better, because when he checked his phone, there was a new message. No number, no sender, just a single sentence. You are almost ready. Ready for what? He didn't know. But deep down, he understood one thing with absolute certainty. This had never been about what happened during those 3 weeks in orbit. That was just the beginning. Something had been watching him long before that. And now, whatever it was getting closer. He tried to resist, tried to ignore the signs, to pretend that his life could still return to something resembling normal. But normal was an illusion now. A distant memory that belonged to someone else, someone who had never left Earth, never stared into the endless void of space, never heard the whispers from the rings of Saturn. Days blurred together. Time slipped through his fingers like sand. He no longer trusted his own thoughts. Were they truly his, or were they placed there? The lines had become too thin, too fragile to separate. Then one night the final message came, not on his phone, not on his computer. It came in his own voice. He had been recording himself for weeks, trying to keep track of what was happening, documenting everything before it could be erased. But this time, when he played the recording back, it was different. The audio started, as usual. His own voice, tired, fractured, speaking about the sleepless nights, the strange patterns he had begun to notice, the way people around him no longer felt real. Then mid-sentence his voice cut out. Silence. A deep, pulsing silence that seemed to breathe. And then his own voice returned. But it wasn't him speaking. It was something else. Something using his tone, his cadence, but layering it with something beneath it, something he couldn't fully hear but could feel vibrating through his bones. It is time, that was all it said, but it was enough. The next morning he woke up in a place he didn't recognize, a vast open field beneath a sky that felt too large, too alive. The air shimmered like heat waves on asphalt, But it wasn't hot. It wasn't cold either. It simply was. And then he saw them. Not the people he had followed, not the ones who had begun to change. These were something else. Tall, elongated figures, moving with a grace that defied gravity. Their bodies, shifting subtly as if they existed in multiple dimensions at once. They stood in perfect stillness, waiting, watching. And then, as one, they raised their hands, not in greeting, not in threat, but in invitation. And he understood. He had never been chosen to report on Saturn. He had been chosen to return to. There was no fear now, no hesitation. He took a step forward, and in that moment the sky above him cracked open like a window into infinity. And then he was gone. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person we want here. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another mind-bending story like this. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, drop a comment below about what you think really happened to him, and share this video with someone who loves mysterious space stories as much as you do. And if you're still craving more, check out our previous videos. You might just find another story that will keep you up at night. See you in the next one.